my AP Stats project, I decided to research the question of, are veterans in the NHL better than rookies in their shot-to-goal ratio? The reason I chose to research this question is because I love watching hockey. I'm really interested by it. My cousin plays hockey, and I watch almost every single game in the NHL. So I decided that this would be a good question to analyze so that I can see which teams coming into the playoffs have the best chance of winning. If it's like a team with more veterans or with more rookies, or if the team just needs a good mix, and then they should be fine. In researching this question, I've also set up quite a few parameters. This includes that I'm only taking into account forwards and centers for a team. Since defenders don't usually go up and score, and goalkeepers, they don't go within they don't go outside 5 meters of their goal, so they would kind of skew the data, I think, or like mess up the data that I collect. For collecting all the data that I needed to use, I used the NHL official website to get the exact data points of the shot-to-goal ratio of every player for a certain team. I picked teams according to who was already qualified for the playoffs. I randomly selected 5 teams using a random number generator, and I then analyzed all the players, or all the forwards and centers for that team over the course of the last 4 games of the season. I picked the last 4 games of the season because that's sort of their form that they're bringing on with them into the playoffs, so that if they play well before the playoffs, they're probably going to play well in the playoffs as well. And they probably have changed the way they played from the very beginning of the season, so I felt like right at the very end was what I needed to analyze in order to get good, concrete data for my analysis. The teams that I finally chose were Nashville, Boston, Tampa, Las Vegas, and Toronto. I then used all the eligible players from those teams to do my analysis on. I am going to have to assume that the teams still play with their best players, so that they are not resting their best players and they're telling the players not to play well since they've already qualified. But one of the teams, Vegas, for example, their best player, William Karlsson, he's been playing about 20 minutes over the last 4 games on average. So I feel like that's sort of enough evidence to show that most of the teams do still play with their best players, and the best players do still perform really well, because Vegas, they had a lot of wins towards the end of the season as well, even though they didn't need it. So yeah, I collected all my data on a spreadsheet, and from there I was able to find the means of the two age groups, the rookies and the veterans, and then I was able to find the standard error between the two, and I created a 95% confidence interval for it. So I found the DF value by using a formula, and then I found the T value that corresponds to that DF value. And then from there I was able to construct my 95% confidence interval. So my overall study is considered an observational study, since I'm just observing how the players perform over their last 4 games of the regular season. I'm not making any new variables or adjusting one of them to see what happens on the other. I'm just sort of letting it play out and see how they perform, and then doing an analysis off of that. So in order to be able to do this experiment, I need to be sure of the conditions that are met. So I have randomized the teams, so the randomness condition is met. So in the entire NHL there's 31 teams, and then 5 teams is roughly 15% or so, but I do feel that it is less than 10% of all the forwards and centers in the entire NHL, so I do feel like that's met as well. The 10% condition, or the success and failure condition, is also met. There's more than 10 of each group. There's roughly 30 of the rookies and 40 of the veterans. One factor that might play into this is that I biasedly chose which games to analyze. I didn't really decide on which games, I just chose the last 4 games of the season, and that might mess up my data a little bit, but I had to do it because I wanted accurate results. So after I had collected all the data and I had organized it, found all the values that I needed, my interval that I got as a result of those data was from negative 0.099 to 0.0213. So according to my interval, I cannot say that one group is better than the other group since 0 is included in the interval. Since it does stretch more onto the negative side though, and this is comparing veterans to rookies, it could be that there is a slight difference, since it shows that rookies might be a little bit more clinical than veterans, and that's because it stretches more onto the negative side. But according to my interval, I can be 95% confident that my interval contains the true percentage difference between the goals to shots ratio between veterans and rookies in the NHL. So even though my interval would show support for a well-rounded team of both rookie and veteran forwards and centers, I do feel inclined to believe that the team with more offensive rookies will be the team that does the best during the playoff season. This is based on the fact that my interval in the study, like I said before, stretches more onto the negative side than the positive. This would lead me to possibly believe that the team that should win the Stanley Cup this year, of all the teams that made it, is Colorado. Colorado have 11 rookies on their team, and 11 of them are forwards. And that's more than any other team has. Behind them, there are two other teams, Washington and Columbus, who both have 10. So it is also likely that they will win or play really well this playoff season. Next behind them is Winnipeg with 9 rookies, which is still quite a lot because you usually have 12 to 14 forwards and centers on a team. And then we have Nashville with 8, and Nashville also has 6 veteran forwards, so they're a pretty well-rounded team as well. So I would expect Nashville and Winnipeg to do well as well. So according to my teams, these should be the highest contenders for the Stanley Cup playoffs this year. For my bracket for the playoffs this year, I did have Nashville winning the entire thing. I had Nashville beating Winnipeg in the first or the second round. I then had both, who was it? I had both Boston and Tampa going far as well. Because Colorado hasn't been playing too well, I didn't think that they would get very far, and especially playing against Nashville, who are in a really good run of form lately. They've scored a lot of goals. I decided against them. And then Washington, I got them all the way to the semifinals on their side, and then ultimately had them losing to Boston. And then so it would be Boston and Nashville in the final. And I based most of those decisions off of the stats that I'd done, and then also partly off of how they've played all season, or especially the last couple months leading up to the playoffs. I looked at a lot of the head-to-head stuff and made my decisions off of that. Some of the challenges that I ran into while conducting the survey was setting up the data sheet and collecting the data. It took a very long time, and I also had to decide on which players to exclude and exactly what I wanted to do. Like setting up the experiment, or the study I mean. It took a little bit of prep time. I had to find out exactly how I was going to incorporate stuff from these last couple of units, and how I was going to finally conduct my my experiment. So once I had my plan though, it flowed rather smoothly. I didn't run into any major challenges after that point, but calculating the different values was a little bit difficult. So I went back and double checked and triple checked all my calculations and equations and formulas to make sure that I was right and I wasn't making any mistakes anywhere. And then every time I reran the results and reran the numbers, I got roughly the same stuff. One of them, I don't know, I got off by 0.01. I don't really know where that came from, but I believe that the final interval that I made is the correct one. For my experiment, there are some obvious extensions and improvements that can be made to it. So if I were to do this again, I would like to maybe analyze defenders as well. Even though they might mess up the data and the interval a little bit, the defensemen for most teams do score quite a lot. Some teams, it's the defenders that have more goals than the entire forward line, which is quite interesting as well. And I think it would be interesting to see if adding the defenders gave me a definitive answer to my question. Since my data and survey or study this time showed that there was no difference, I wonder if I do include the defenders, will I find a difference? That is one thing I would love to do if I were to do this again. I might also want to try to analyze more games and more teams. This should narrow down the interval as well and make my results more reliable. since I would have a bigger sample size and the entire population of players in the NHL would be included, I feel like it would give me a lot better results, and then I can find out exactly the difference. So I might even do a census. That might be a possibility as well, because then I can see exactly how the rookies do compared to the veterans. But then I wouldn't have to set up a 95% confidence interval, because then I would have the data right in front of me. I could see if there was a difference or if there's really not a difference. So yeah, that is my study for this unit.